As an anonymous quote says, "The grass isn't always greener on the other side." This quote is a perfect representation of Ralph Bowling and Leonard Streeb's lives as they returned to America. The Vietnam War soldiers were not treated astoundingly in Vietnam itself, but when they got home, they were treated poorly by their own country, and it created conflict for them as they ventured home to try to go back to civilian life. Over 2 million Americans served their country in Vietnam War. Over 58,000 American troops were killed, and 300,000 were wounded. 75,000 soldiers returned severely disabled. The Vietnam War was America's longest war and was fought in Southeast Asia. It began November 1st, 1955, and ended April 30th, 1975. The 20-year conflict was fought between the Communist government of North Vietnam, who were supported by the Chinese, and the armies of South Vietnam, who were supported by the United States of America. The North Vietnamese wanted a reunification of the two countries under communism. The United States, in line with their policy of containment during the Cold War, were determined to prevent communist aggression and provide South Vietnam government with considerable aid and support. The U.S. finally sent in troops to fight, as well as the prolonged Vietnam War escalated in 1965. Many soldiers did not want to go to Vietnam, but they had to end conflict by going to war. They also had to compromise the rest of their lives with the aftermath of what war does to a soldier. Soldiers like Ralph Bowling were drafted.
I had no desire to join the military. I knew that I never wanted to be a career person in the military. But they had what they called a lottery, and they drew numbers for birth dates to see who was going to be drafted.
The soldiers had no idea what lied ahead for them, and what they were about to encounter would affect them for the rest of their lives.
But to see a human body laying there that was not even recognizable, and it was just, stuff was everywhere. That was pretty tough to take.
Leonard Streeb volunteered to join the Air Force. He flew down to Vietnam with 66 men and returned home with only 6 men. His job was to fly OH-6, the decoy helicopter, so his fellow soldiers would know where the Vietnamese soldiers were hiding. Living conditions were tough for the soldiers in Vietnam.
Well, we would go out into the jungle. They would take us out in helicopters, and they would drop us off, and we would be in the jungle for 20 to 25 days. We carried a rucksack.
Being injured at Firebase Marianne is one experience Mr. Bowling will never forget.
About 2 o'clock in the morning, nice foggy morning. North Vietnamese had trained people who could break into your encampment. They were called sappers. And they started shooting mortar rounds into our fire base. With the end result, they killed 33 and wounded 88 of us. I was one of the 88 that was wounded. Our captain was killed, lieutenants, everybody was killed. That's when I got wounded. I had to play dead in a trench. I could hear them behind me walking through the trench and shooting people. I was afraid that they were going to shoot me, so I just played dead in the trench. Things that go through your mind, you don't flash back and see your whole life before you. Not in my case, but I did think of 2 things. How was I going to get off this mountain? Because I assumed I was the last one there. And what my family was going to think when they got a call that I was dead.
Sadly, many soldiers did not make it.
By the way, my best friend was killed in Vietnam, so he got drafted a month before me, and I never saw him again after he got drafted.
There are many reasons why the Vietnam War embodies the conflict and compromise of the Cold War era. One of these conflicts includes the mistreatment of the Vietnam War soldiers in America, and the ultimate compromise by forcing the soldiers to live in a life of solitude.
For years, other than my very close friends and my family, nobody knew that I'd even been in Vietnam or even been in the Army. Most of the people that I worked with for 40 years, they probably still don't know that I was in the Army or in Vietnam.
When American soldiers returned home from World War II in 1945, they were greeted as heroes in the United States. Cities and towns across the country held parades to honor their returning veterans and recognize the sacrifices they had made. But the homecoming was very different for most Vietnam veterans. They came back to find the United States torn apart by debate over the Vietnam War. There were no victory parades or welcome home rallies. Instead, most Vietnam veterans returned to a society that did not seem to care about them. Instead, it seemed they had viewed them in distrust and anger. Many soldiers did not want to go to Vietnam, but they had to end conflict by going to war. They also had to compromise the rest of their lives with the aftermath of what war does to a soldier. Even today, 4 out of 5 Vietnam veterans experience PTSD.
Didn't like to be around people at all. Didn't like to have my back to people. I still don't really appreciate people sitting behind me in a restaurant or anywhere. We go to the movies, I sit in the very top row.
One of the longest lasting conflicts and compromises of being in the Vietnam War is the PTSD that the veterans have to deal with. This can cause a great deal of depression in their lives. During the 1970s, when mental illness was not recognized for Vietnam War veterans, many men and women suffered without anyone or anything to turn to. Some were so scared and ashamed that they even took their own lives because they lost all hope, their family, and their friends. Suicides among Vietnam veterans have been said to be 50,000 to 100,000. These suicides opened up some other soldiers' eyes, and it was like a domino effect. They realized there was a way to get out of the pain they endured daily. More and more soldiers took their own lives to escape the pain and hopelessness. Many soldiers gave their lives for their country, and many took their own lives upon return. Many veterans are homeless even today and are dealing with a great deal of PTSD due to the war. Despite the conflict the soldiers had during and after the Vietnam War, many of them, much like Ralph Bowling and Leonard Streeb, would compromise their lives for our freedom.
Would I do it again? Absolutely, I would do it again. Even through all the hardships and getting wounded and having to take people's lives, I would absolutely do it again. You got to have a love for the flag and the country. You have to.
Ralph Bowling and Leonard Streeb served their country proud. They overcame obstacles that succumbed many soldiers' lives in Vietnam and back in America. Although many veterans still suffer due to the long-term compromise taken by Vietnam veterans, many Americans still take for granted the sacrifice that soldiers took to keep those freedoms. Great pride is taken today by many for what the soldiers did for their country. Many Americans value the freedoms of today due to their and many others' sacrifices during the Cold War era.